Look, I'm giving you a pass this time, okay? Just come back. I'll look the other way, just for now. What is this guy going on about? He must be clueless. Time to give him a dose of harsh reality. My name is Olivia, and I'm 32. Been married to my husband Mason for a year now. We met at a party, a casual get-together hosted by a friend. We hit it off, started dating like any other couple, and eventually tied the knot. We're not getting any younger after all. Mason's not the most exciting guy, but he brings a sense of peace. That's why I thought we'd make it till the end, till we're old and gray. We both work, so going hungry is not on the cards. Got married without overthinking. I handle most of the housework since we're both busy with our jobs. Mason never helps. He's either lounging around or heads out early, rarely spending time at home. But I never found housework to be a burden. My parents lived like this too. I accepted this as the kind of life a wife would have. I have a 9-to-5 job and I'm not overloaded with hobbies. Mason and I were never chatty to begin with. We both respected each other's space and it was never an issue. Life went on. One night, Mason came home late, presumably from drinking with coworkers, friends, who knows. I welcomed him. Mason, you're home late. Had a long night out, huh? Dinner's still there if you want it, but I guess you're not eating this late, are you? He turned around and said nothing, and walked into the living room, ignoring me. I sighed. Here we go again. Whenever Mason is in a bad mood, he gets very quiet. So I figured something at work or during his night out must have upset him. Best to let him be. I know better than to poke the bear when he's like this. I felt his presence from the living room, but shrugged it off and went to bed. He'll probably be back to his cheerful self by morning. It was the same old story. And I didn't give it a second thought. The next morning, while I was preparing breakfast, Mason came into the kitchen. Good morning, I greeted him cheerfully. Mason glanced at me, grabbed some milk from the fridge, and left without a word. I was a bit surprised by his coldness. It wasn't like him. Seems like he's still in a bad mood. I never thought I'd see the day. I'm aware that we were a family of strong, independent individuals. I hadn't made a point to talk to Mason, really. I decided to wait and see. So I continued prepping lunchboxes for both Mason and myself. However, things didn't go back to normal that easily. Mason remained distant the following night and the day after. At this point, I was genuinely concerned. Days turned into weeks and Mason continued to give me the silent treatment. I tried reaching out through WhatsApp and even left him notes, but he ignored it all. However, he'd eat the meals I prepared. I noticed the empty lunchbox in the sink, so I knew he ate the packed lunch. So I put a note in the cooler bag. I thought if he found a note while enjoying the lunch I made with love, he'd have to react. But that was another miss. Mason said nothing. Before I knew it, over a month had passed in this strange silence. I felt helpless. I had tried everything, but nothing worked. Then one evening, I took a drastic step. I deliberately didn't prepare dinner. Every evening, I made dinner when I got home. But what if I didn't? How would Mason, who's been ignoring me, react? I decided to find out. But when Mason came home, I pretended to be watching TV in the living room. Mason came into the living room and looked intently at the table where dinner usually waited, but tonight the table was empty. After looking at the barren table, Mason turned his gaze to me. Holding my breath, I waited for him to say something, but he walked out of the living room in complete silence. I heard the front door open and shut with a bang. I was stunned. Why am I being ignored like this? I had no idea why. I was left bewildered, sitting alone on the living room couch. The next morning, I woke up and went to the living room. Mason was already gone. Did he go to work already? Curious, I looked on the living room table and found a note. Reading the words on it, my eyes went wide. "Stop skipping out on your wifely duties," it read, scribbled hastily in a messy handwriting. Something inside me snapped. That's it. I'm done. Why do I have to keep pleasing Mason? Is this going to be my life forever? We were never a clingy couple, but this is just unacceptable. And there's no reason for him to do this, nor an opportunity for me to even ask about it. For the last month, the stifling silence in the house has been unbearable. I wrote next to Mason's scribble, I'm going back to my parents' house. I quickly packed up my things and went home. My sudden arrival did surprise my parents, but after I explained how Mason had been ignoring me for over a month without any apparent reason, they understood and welcomed me warmly. It felt good to be in an environment where I could have a normal conversation. For now, I decided to stay here and see how Mason reacts before deciding on my next steps. I didn't hear from Mason the day I left. Knowing him, he's probably assuming I'm just trying to make a point and will continue to ignore me. Well, let's see how long this lasts. Days turned into weeks, and there was still no call or message from Mason via WhatsApp or any other means. He didn't even bother to visit my parents' house. Before I knew it, half a year had passed. I had nearly forgotten about Mason altogether. Then, one day, as I was leaving my parents' house to go shopping, there he was. Mason, standing with a defiant and angry expression. I was shocked and froze in my tracks. Mason just glared at me, still not saying a word. Is this game still going on? It was almost laughable how silent Mason was. But then, in the next moment, he tried to walk into my parents' house without saying a word. Whoa, hold on there. I stopped him. Mason looked at me, his face a mix of anger and disbelief, but still silent. I warned. I said, don't just walk in. I will call the police. Finally, after more than 6 months, Mason spoke, a snide smile on his lips. Look, at you, getting all uppity with me? Since when do you get so high and mighty? Just because you're at your parents' house doesn't mean you can act like that, you know? I remember Mason being a bit rough around the edges, but not like this. Lost in thought, I was jolted back to reality when Mason suddenly erupted. What the hell are you thinking? You leave the house for half a year, enjoying yourself at your parents' home? Get a grip! Mason ranted on, then spread his arms out as if to say, I can't believe this. Look, I'll give you a break this time, right? Just come home, I'm willing to turn a blind eye, this time. Mason spoke so condescendingly. I calmly retorted, I think you're confused. You and I are strangers now, you know. Mason's face went blank, then turned beet red with rage. He started yelling again. What the hell are you saying? Did you lose your mind? We're married, aren't we? Stop messing around. His intense outburst silenced me for a moment, and he kept yelling, I'm saying I'll forgive you this time, so stop fooling around and pack your bags. At that moment, my own anger boiled over. He talks like he's doing me a favor by forgiving me, as if I've done something wrong. That infuriated me even more. Moreover, it seemed Mason had no clue what had happened in the last 6 months. Finally, I snapped at Mason, who was still yelling away. I received divorce papers from your mother, signed them, and already filed them with the court, so we're not married anymore, got it? We're strangers. Total strangers. Understand? I emphasized the word strangers, and Mason looked at me, his face drained of color. He seemed genuinely shocked. Here's what happened. A month after I moved back to my parents' home, my then mother-in-law, Helen, called me to a cafe near our house. We had never been close, and I hadn't seen her for a while. After brief pleasantries, she handed me an envelope. What's this? I asked, tilting my head. Open it. Even you will understand, she said. In response, I opened an envelope and pulled out the paper inside. It was a divorce petition, already signed and stamped by Mason. Confused, I looked at Helen. The eyes of his mother, who was glaring at me, were the same as Mason's, full of disdain. While putting the divorce petition back into the envelope, I asked his mother, So, Is this Mason's doing? I asked her. Did he say anything to you about this? Helen let out an exaggerated sigh before answering. Oh, yes, he said plenty. Would you like to hear? I smiled at her and replied, Yes, please go ahead. She launched into her story. According to her, Mason had been bad-mouthing me for a while now, saying that I was a useless and incompetent wife, who stopped doing any housework after we got married, that I quit my job and lazed around at home all day, and that whenever something didn't go my way, I would run back to my parents and act like a spoiled child. Helen's eyes never left mine as she spoke, and it was clear she believed every word of Mason's lies. There was no point in arguing with her, I thought. When she was done talking, Helen finally asked, So, what are you going to do? Not that I want to meddle, but you're being pretty awful, you know. By the time I walked out of that house, my mind was made up. I smiled and told her, if he wants a divorce, then that's what he'll get. Helen glared at me one last time, slapped some money on the table for her share, and walked out of the cafe. I went straight to my parents' house, signed the divorce papers, and submitted them to the court the very next day. While I was explaining all of this, Mason's face turned increasingly pale. It seemed he hadn't been informed by Helen at all, but honestly, I didn't care. After all, I had already entrusted Helen with the signed divorce papers. Mason must have had the same idea in mind, I figured. Once I finished telling my side, Mason blurted out in a panic. No, you've got it all wrong. I only filled out those divorce papers to keep my mom off my back. I never intended to submit them. They're invalid. Panicked or just confused, he started making no sense. And besides, you're the one who will suffer if we divorce, so let's go to the court right now and have them withdrawn. I gave Mason a cold stare, then tilted my head. Why would it be a problem for me if we got divorced? Mason suddenly grinned as if he had won. Think about your age. At your age with a divorce history, no one will want you. That's why I'm saying I'll take you back. This is for your benefit. You get it? I'm saying we can pretend the divorce never happened and you should be happy. I couldn't help but roll my eyes at his arrogance and delusional thinking. Listen, we're not kids. A divorce doesn't just get erased, and for the record, I'm already married to someone else. Mason's jaw dropped and he went silent. What? Really? Do you want me to repeat myself? I'm married to someone else. Mason, who had a look of disbelief, suddenly started making a fuss. That's a lie. You're just trying to look good, aren't you? You're making up stories to get me to go away, aren't you? You're really making a fool out of me, you know that? Such lies won't work. Well, if he wants to be a fool, that's his problem. As I was wondering how to explain to this idiot, a presence came from behind me and a man appeared at the entrance. The man looked at me and Mason alternately, looking confused. Mason, for his part, was surprised to see a stranger coming out of my parents' home and fell silent. When I looked at the man, he tilted his head and asked, Is something wrong? Feeling awkward, I smiled and turned to Mason. This is my husband, Noah. Noah greeted Mason with a slight skeptical nod. Mason took a step back and looked up at Noah. It made sense. Noah was a former national rugby player with an imposing physique. Overwhelmed by Noah's appearance, Mason suddenly started to make excuses. No, you've got it all wrong. My old boss told me, you've been married for about a year now and your wife might start to get a little uncomfortable. Better put her in her place. So I did. And guess what? Turns out he got dumped by his wife and kids. What a fool, right? I was just doing what he told me to do. I never wanted to do any of that stuff. You understand, right, Olivia? I looked at Mason with a gaze filled with disgust, fed up with his pathetic excuses. Mason looked puzzled, maybe because my reaction wasn't what he expected. Then Noah spoke up. Sorry, but could you leave immediately and never come back here? If you approach Olivia again, I'll call the police. As he said this, Noah firmly pushed Mason out of the doorway. Intimidated by Noah's force and determination, Mason fled the scene. For a while, we both remained wary, concerned that Mason might harbor a grudge and do something irrational. But days turned into weeks and we never heard from him again. One day, curiosity got the best of me, and I reached out to a mutual friend to inquire about Mason. We began by catching up on casual topics, but when I asked about Mason, our friend sighed and filled me in. Surprisingly, Mason had quit his job just a few days after showing up at my parents' house. The reason? Turns out Mason was always in agreement with his boss, who he trusted. When the boss harassed subordinates at work, it became a big issue in the company. As a result, the boss was resigned. Resigned being a euphemism. He was basically demoted to some remote mountainous area I'd never heard of. Apparently, Mason was expected to be transferred as well, but he quit out of pride. According to our friend, he's still jobless. He's been looking for work, but his arrogance has hindered his efforts. Even when recruiters offer him opportunities, he declines interviews. Furthermore, news of him quitting reached his mother, who then disowned him due to her own extreme personality. Finally, our friend said, "He blames everything on his old manager and just drowns his sorrows every day. At this rate, he'll ruin his health before he ever finds another job. It's a mess. I hope he finds a new spouse or something, though that's unlikely." We both chuckled as we hung up the phone. Mason seems to be drowning his days in job hunting and drinking. Thanks to him, I am now living a peaceful life with Noah. Interestingly, Noah was actually my colleague. Upon hearing about my divorce, he had eagerly pursued me. Though we started dating with only 6 months after my divorce, which made me somewhat hesitant, I was quickly drawn to his confident manner and kind personality. After getting married, Noah told me that he had always had a crush on me, and he was heartbroken when I got married. I laughed and apologized for not noticing his feelings sooner. Noah helps me around the house, a task I used to handle alone. Whenever we eat together, he always says how delicious the food is with a smile. It's these little things that make me incredibly happy, something I never expected. I was probably numb to it all, having grown up with old-fashioned parents. Now I am living a sparkling married life with Noah, who always delights in even the most ordinary things. I'm convinced that with him, I'll have a happy life all the way through our golden years, and so I was certain.
Why are you sitting down? It's common sense for a wife to stand. I was 7 months pregnant. At a family gathering, my stomach started hurting, so I sat down, only for my husband to kick my stomach. "Hey, Thomas, what the hell do you think you're doing?" "Shut up! Besides, it's probably just a girl in there." Brian also changed his tone and called out to Thomas. But Thomas retorted without any regard for me and arrogantly dismissed it. I watched Thomas as he walked away. Unaware of my gaze, Thomas sat down with a mean smirk. However, my gaze shifted to a person who stood up in front of Thomas. This person walked up to the seated Thomas and then took a certain action against him. My name is Elizabeth. I'm 30 years old. I moved from the countryside to New York for college and then found a job. I married Thomas 2 years ago, and we're now expecting our first child. I met Thomas at work, where he was the son of the president of a client company. Thomas has an older brother, Brian, who works as a senior executive in the company and is a so-called elite with a degree from a foreign university. There are rumors that Brian might become the president. Although Thomas isn't the heir, he seems to intend to work in the company as a senior executive for a long time. At first, I wondered why someone like him would take an interest in me. But Thomas's persistent courtship didn't stop, and I eventually started dating him. Thomas was very kind, and his company was stable with a long history. I became more attracted to Thomas and decided to get married. I quit my job when we got married, influenced by a comment from my mother-in-law, Karen. It's only natural for a woman to focus on her family after getting married. And at least until the child is 3 years old, the mother should raise them. When I announced my pregnancy, Karen first told me this. Apparently, she didn't like that Brian's wife, Linda, didn't quit her job even after getting pregnant and giving birth. It's pitiful to send children to preschool. Working while leaving your child in preschool makes our company look bad. Karen would badmouth and complain about Linda every time we went to visit. Thomas, hearing this, wouldn't stop Karen's complaint. Brian's just too lenient with Linda, but would instead agree with her. I don't have any entrepreneurs in my circle. So maybe there's something I don't understand between the eldest son's wife and the mother-in-law. That's why I couldn't say anything about their conversations. However, perhaps interpreting my silence as agreement, both Thomas and Karen thought I shared their views, and their bad-mouthing of Linda only escalated. After all, it's not like the company would be in trouble without Linda working. Maybe Linda is saving up money for when she divorces Brian. Nothing good comes when a woman has money. There were times when I thought it was too much, but I was too ashamed to argue back. I had heard that Linda wanted to work because she felt the company couldn't function without her. But Karen seemed to dislike that statement itself. Elizabeth quit right away, so we don't have to worry about that. Unlike Linda, I wasn't against quitting my job. So, I didn't resist much when I was told to quit. However, I definitely felt uncomfortable with Karen and Thomas, who never asked about my feelings. Because of this, I became a housewife right after getting married. But then, Thomas started to make comments that seemed to look down on me. "You're not working, so at least do the housework properly." He would complain like this when he came home. Of course, I did what I could, like cleaning, laundry, and preparing meals. But as a newbie housewife, I didn't know what more I could do, and I started to feel uneasy whenever Thomas was around. When I went to my parents' house, Thomas would even complain to Karen that I, a housewife, couldn't even do household chores properly. Believing him, Karen also started to complain to me. "Elizabeth, it's troublesome if you don't properly support Thomas. The wives of my sons are all so useless." Karen started to scold me too, and I felt smaller every time I visited my husband's family. Yet, at least it's better than Brian's place. Those two don't even bother to visit our home. Well, that's true. But hearing that made it impossible for me to distance myself from my husband's family. I feared the backlash I might face if I ever distanced myself from them, especially after seeing Thomas's proud expression every time those words were said. Gradually, I began to think that I was better off than Linda, the eldest son's wife, despite how harshly Thomas treated me or how much Karen scolded me. Thinking I was better than Linda somehow helped me get through it. Time passed since our marriage, and I found out I was pregnant. Both Thomas's parents and Thomas himself were very happy about it. One day, I went shopping alone. It was for dinner groceries. However, I started feeling sick on the way and couldn't make it to the supermarket, ending up sitting on the side of the road. "Are you okay?" Someone approached me at that moment. "Oh, isn't this Elizabeth? What happened?" It was Linda, coincidentally. She had just finished her part-time job and was on her way to pick up her daughter from preschool. Among those who passed by me without a word, Linda stopped her car to check on me. Having heard so much about Linda from Karen and Thomas, I didn't trust her and brushed her off. "I'm fine." I pushed her away, but Linda stubbornly said, "I'll drive you home, so get in the car." I hadn't finished shopping, but I wasn't in a condition to shop. Hesitantly, I got into her car, and Linda bought me tea and drove me home. It felt like it had been a long time since someone had been so kind to me. I was moved to tears. Maybe it was because the morning sickness had made me emotionally fragile. Linda listened to my story the entire way and comforted me. Later, remembering my complaint about not being able to eat anything due to morning sickness, she brought me jelly and ice cream. "These are what I eat, so I don't know if you can eat them, Elizabeth." I was very grateful when she handed them to me. However, that night, when Thomas opened the refrigerator, he frowned at its contents in confusion. "What's with this jelly? And all this ice cream? It's a waste of money, especially when you're not working," I retorted. "No, that's not it. Linda brought them over because I was having a hard time with morning sickness and couldn't manage." "Linda did?" I nodded in response. I explained how Linda had coincidentally helped me when I felt ill on the street and couldn't move, and how she had later brought me some snacks. Hearing this, Thomas frowned. "I see, we've caused her trouble." Or, "That was kind of her." That's why I told him the story, but Thomas's reaction was far from what I had imagined. "What are you doing? Don't make us owe that couple anything." After I finished my story, Thomas said that, holding his head in his hands. "Huh? Why? She helped us. There's no need to talk like that." I couldn't help but voice my opinion. Then, Thomas glared at me with sharp eyes and slowly took out a trash bag. "Just throw this away," and began to throw away the snacks one by one. I could only watch in shock. "Never rely on the money from someone who disregards mom's advice and works on her own." Thomas said that. In Thomas's view, Karen's words were absolute. I couldn't find the words to respond. After that, Linda contacted me a few times, concerned about my health, but I always told her I was fine to avoid any trouble with Thomas. There were days when I felt so ill I wanted to ask someone for help. No matter how bad my morning sickness was, if I cut corners with the housework, Thomas would complain. Yet, the one thing I couldn't do was ask Linda for help. Somehow, my morning sickness settled down, and I reached 7 months of pregnancy. At the recent checkup, the baby's growth was on track, and we found out the gender, so we slowly started preparing for the arrival. It looks like the baby is going to be a girl. I reported to Thomas right away. Huh. But he seemed not very interested. Maybe men have a harder time feeling the reality of becoming a parent, and Thomas is probably no exception. I didn't say anything more about it. Then we welcomed the new year. Every new year, relatives gather at my husband's family home. Even my brother-in-law's family, who usually don't visit, come with their whole family for the new year. I'm home. Happy New Year! We visited my husband's family home together on January 2nd. Happy New Year! Elizabeth, how are you feeling? It seemed the brother-in-law's family had arrived earlier, and Linda immediately spoke to me. She's fine. Don't worry about it. Even though she was addressing me, Thomas responded with a forced smile to Linda and went inside without properly greeting her. Elizabeth, I've been waiting for you. It's been lonely without someone to talk to. Karen welcomed me as usual. Despite Linda being there, Karen said she was lonely, which made me greet her with a wry smile. However, the incident happened that night. To prepare for dinner, Karen, Linda, and I were in the kitchen. Apart from us, there were about 15 relatives, including my father-in-law's siblings, gathered at my husband's family home. Thomas, who had already started toasting with the relatives, was speaking the loudest. Work is going smoothly, and Elizabeth listens well to me and Mom, so my life is going great with a good wife. That wasn't a compliment to me. It was clear to everyone that it was a dig at Brian and Linda. Elizabeth, could you bring the beer? Yes. Karen seemed to find me more convenient to use than Linda, always asking me for help. I was bustling around with my big belly. But, inevitably, I started to feel some discomfort from moving too much. Linda was the first to notice. Elizabeth, you've been rubbing your stomach. Are you in pain? Oh, really? You should have said something. You need to rest for a bit. Karen quickly responded to Linda's observation. Though her tone was a bit sharp, she told me to take a break. Thinking I'd be in the way in the kitchen, I sat in a chair in the room next to the living room, rubbing my belly and watching what was happening around me. In front of me, Brian was feeding his and Linda's son, Anthony. Are you okay, Elizabeth? If you can't do something, you should tell Mom. Your health is important. Thank you. Brian said that to me. And we chatted for a bit. We talked about when Anthony was born and what he likes now. Hearing stories from Brian, a father, was very insightful, and it was clear he was very involved in parenting. Do you know the gender of your baby? Yes, it seems to be a girl. That'll be cute. However, Thomas, who overheard this, seemed displeased and stood up with a sour expression. I thought he might be heading to the bathroom, but instead, he came straight over to me. Why are you sitting down? What? I was taken aback by his sudden question. As I asked Thomas for clarification, he shockingly kicked my stomach. It wasn't with much force, but I involuntarily cried out and doubled over in the chair, clutching my belly. The shock of being treated that way left me unable to move, more than the pain itself. Dramatic much. It's common sense for a wife to stand. Why are you sitting here chatting while making Mom work? Hey, Thomas. What do you think you're doing? What's the big deal? It's just a girl in there anyway. Eventually, she'll get married and leave, and she won't be any use to the company, so it's fine. Brian's tone changed as he addressed Thomas. However, Thomas retorted without any consideration for me and arrogantly dismissed it. Hey, that's too much. Although I couldn't see who it was, I heard a relative calling Thomas out. I've decided not to be a pathetic husband who spoils his wife like someone else. If my wife is being negligent, it's up to me to correct her. Laughing, Thomas said this and then walked away from me. The problem is that Brian can't control Linda. He lets her do whatever she wants. Do you think someone like that can control the company in the future? Dad should think about it. I think I'm more suited to be the president. I'm sure Mom thinks the same. Hearing this, I felt like I finally understood what Thomas was thinking. Thomas's behavior of affirming everything Karen said and acting under her influence was probably to gain her support. The same goes for saying bad things about Brian and others. It seems that Karen was upset about losing the position of president to her eldest son, Brian, so she decided to have Karen tell her father-in-law to make her president. That's why he had been forcing me to act in a way that would make Karen like me. I glared at Thomas, who was laughing and sitting in his own seat, unaware of my gaze. However, my attention then shifted to my father-in-law, Richard, who stood up in front of Thomas. Richard, confirming that Thomas had sat down, silently stood up and approached Thomas. What? And then, Richard kicked Thomas hard. Everyone was left speechless by this. Even Thomas was stunned and unable to speak, staggering from the impact. You don't have a child inside you, so it should be fine. And if a child is wrong, it's up to the father to correct them. Richard said this and tried to grab Thomas by the collar. Dad, calm down. The one who stopped him was Brian, who had been ridiculed by Thomas all this time. Brian, aren't you upset about being talked down to all this time? Richard said this, but Brian just laughed. Not at all. I actually felt sorry for him. What? Because it's true, right? Obsessing over the title of president to the point where you can't even cherish your family. If you're that desperate to be president, then go ahead, let Thomas do it. Thomas turned beet red at those words. The company and the title of president that he wanted so much. Maybe he felt like he had lost to Brian, who had said something that made him give it away so easily. And maybe he was also embarrassed by being called pitiful. Plus, I believe families should work together and respect each other, not control each other. The same goes for our employees. I want to create a company where employees cooperate and respect each other. Since I'm not good at controlling people, Thomas, who can control things better, should do it. Besides, my family is more important to me. It was clear who was more suited to be president. Despite Brian provocatively offering the presidency to Thomas twice, Thomas, being the person in question, couldn't find the words to respond and just turned redder. He only opened and closed his mouth without saying anything coherent. All right, that's enough. Linda was the one who changed the tense atmosphere. Thank you, Richard, for standing up for Brian. Richard showed a slightly embarrassed expression at her words. And Thomas looked down, even more frustrated. Thomas, did you think Brian couldn't control me because I sent Anthony to preschool before he was 3, just like Karen said? Because that's the reality, right? We're a president's family, and we have to consider how it looks from the outside. Brian really thought about it. He wouldn't let you work, Linda. Thomas only seemed confident when he could argue back. I was utterly astounded by such a Thomas. Indeed, that's true. But it's not like Brian didn't think about it. He asked me to quit too. But I wanted to work, so I asked him. If you're going to blame someone, blame me alone. Compared to them, Brian and Linda seemed wonderful to me. Their relationship, where they care for and respect each other's desires, was admirable. It made me feel foolish for ever worrying about what Karen said. Until the child is 3? What's that about? Was Karen saying such arbitrary things? Richard seemed unaware of Karen's statements and sighed in exasperation, apologizing. I'm sorry, Linda and Elizabeth, for any distress caused by Karen's words. Please, there's no need to apologize. And hearing Thomas's words earlier, I'm truly sorry, Elizabeth, for how Thomas's foolishness must have made you feel uncomfortable. Richard sincerely apologized to us without concern for others' opinions. Instead of needing an apology, I felt guilty that Richard was apologizing to us when he was actually protecting us. Karen, who had come into the living room at some point, was flustered by Richard's demeanor. I just meant... She tried to make excuses with an uncomfortable expression. While I believe her comment about children staying home until age 3 wasn't intended to be malicious, the fact remains that her complaints and harsh words hurt Linda and pressured me. Karen, don't make excuses. Isn't it embarrassing to interfere in parenting? Richard reprimanded Karen, who seemed to finally realize the foolishness and irresponsibility of her words. Linda, we're truly grateful to your family's company. Of course, you're welcome to continue working. We understand that the company can't function without you, so please continue to support us in both business and personal matters. Richard then addressed Linda, which confused everyone. Thomas, Karen, myself, and even the other relatives were puzzled by his words. Dad, remember we agreed not to talk about Linda's family business? Brian said with a laugh, followed by a troubled smile from Linda. What does that mean? I asked Linda, as I'm sure everyone was wondering the same. Linda opened her mouth to meet his expectations. My dad's the president of the company. My marriage to Brian and the company have nothing to do with each other, but it seems Brian only told Richard about it. The room went silent at Linda's words. The company she mentioned was well known in the area, much larger than Richard's and also a business partner. Linda's father, the president, was busy and disliked public appearances, so no one knew his face. Karen and Thomas had met him as Linda's father, but had no idea he was the president. Linda worked as an executive director in her family's company. The revelation shocked Thomas and Karen, who had been disparaging Linda's work. The two of them have been making fun of Linda, who works there. They probably never expected her to be the daughter of the president of a company that their company is indebted to. They were at a loss for words, unable to even formulate an apology. However, it's clear after today's events that I cannot entrust the company to Thomas. Thomas finally received a definitive statement from his father-in-law. I understand you care about the company and its dealings, but a company is its employees. Someone who can't cherish their family can't possibly cherish their employees. Thomas, pale-faced, pleaded for forgiveness with a deep apology. You're right, Dad. I was wrong. Please give me another chance. Despite Thomas's desperation, Richard raised his voice again. You're apologizing to the wrong person. At those words, Thomas, shaking, stood up and staggered towards me. I instinctively covered my belly, fearing he might do something again. Seeing this, Thomas seemed hurt and began to cry, kneeling down. "Elizabeth, I'm sorry. The baby must have been hurt too. I'm so sorry." Thomas broke down in tears, appearing to truly regret his actions. Behind him, Karen also muttered, "Linda, I'm sorry. I said terrible things to you." Linda, hearing this, smiled and dismissed it. "You should be apologizing to Elizabeth. She's been under a lot of pressure listening to my complaints. And the baby in her belly must have heard all of Grandma's words too." Karen, taken aback by Linda's words, apologized to me. "Elizabeth, I'm sorry." Both seemed genuinely remorseful, and Linda and I shared a smile. However, Richard was not satisfied with their apologies. "Karen and Thomas, get out. I don't want to see your faces today." He then had Karen and Thomas leave the room. After they left awkwardly, a relative spoke up. "Come on, Elizabeth and Linda, let's eat together." "Yes, let's eat." "Yes." And so, surrounded by everyone, Linda and I enjoyed a pleasant meal. For the first time visiting my husband's family home, I spent an enjoyable evening. Richard's anger didn't subside for a while, and Thomas was eventually banned from the house. His dream of becoming the president vanished, and though he remained at the company, there was no sign of advancement from his position as a regular employee. Perhaps because of this, Thomas no longer talked incessantly about the company. When I, unable to forgive him for kicking my stomach, suggested divorce, he offered a deep apology and promised never to drink alcohol again. I proposed a separation, but Thomas, with nowhere else to go, ended up staying at the company, managing with delivery meals and showering at a gym. This lifestyle seemed to take its toll, as Thomas lost a considerable amount of weight within a month. However, he continued to work daily and kept in touch with me. "Do you need anything? How's your health?" Gradually, I began to open up to Thomas again. Feeling pity for him, I told him he could return home, and upon his return, Thomas apologized once more. He seemed like a changed person, not only refraining from complaining about housework, but also taking the initiative to do it. "You rest, Elizabeth." Now, with my growing belly, he even takes care of the more strenuous cleaning tasks for me. Richard, seeing this change, has allowed Thomas to visit the family home again when he has time. Karen has also become much quieter, no longer speaking ill of Linda. "I want to work hard for my family now, rather than just for the company." Thomas now often expresses such sentiments. Although I can never fully forgive him for kicking my stomach, I believe people can change. With the current Thomas, I feel confident we can happily welcome our baby.
Thank you so much. Our daughters were very fond of their gentle grandfather, and we spent many peaceful days together. But sadly, this peace didn't last long. Just a few months after mother-in-law passed away, father-in-law suddenly collapsed too. Father-in-law survived, but he was bedridden and needed constant care. During a discussion about father-in-law's care, he mentioned wanting to go to a nursing home to avoid being a burden, but Morris stepped in. "Don't say things like that, Dad. Family should care for each other. Nursing homes are for when family absolutely can't. Alvina said she's okay with taking care of you," he said, completely taking me by surprise. I did love father-in-law. I wanted to do whatever I could to help him. Even if he went to a nursing home, I was planning to visit him frequently, but caring for him full-time at home was a different matter entirely. It was clear that Morris wouldn't help. As a stay-at-home mom with young kids to look after, taking care of father-in-law would be a significant challenge. But I couldn't express my reluctance in front of father-in-law, who was different from mother-in-law. I had no choice but to agree to his care. As expected, the caregiving was quite difficult. I needed to assist him with meals, bathroom visits, and bathing. Father-in-law was a robust, elderly man, and as a member of the opposite sex, we both felt uncomfortable at times. Every day, I'd assist with the kids' school preparations and breakfast, do housework during the day, care for the kids when they got home, and prepare dinner, all on top of caring for father-in-law. Every night before going to sleep, I'd think, I somehow made it through the day. Then I would just collapse into bed. Morris, instead of helping with father-in-law's care, started spending even less time at home, citing work as an excuse. He claimed to have overnight work and only came home about 2 to 3 times a week. Furthermore, because I never knew when he'd come back home, I often struggled to prepare dinner in time. On days when my body ached from the sheer exhaustion, I would prepare something simple. But even then, Morris would rage, I'm working my tail off there, and this is the thanks I get? When I asked him for a little help around the house or with caring for his father, he retorted, You're a full-time homemaker, aren't you? Caring for my father is your job. I felt miserable every day. This distressing situation dragged on for 3 years. My 2 daughters grew older and began to help with housework and caring for their grandfather, which helped lighten the burden. Chantel pitched in every day, helping with cooking and cleaning. Janie tenderly wiped her grandfather's back each day, asking, Does that feel good, Grandpa? I was truly grateful to have such kind daughters. One day, Morris left his mobile phone at home when he went to work. Despite knowing better, I couldn't resist the temptation to take a look inside his phone. The password was his birthday, so I could unlock it instantly. What I found inside was a succession of shocking revelations. Unbelievably, Morris had been having an affair since around the time I started caring for his father, and they even had a child together. From their text messages, it was clear that Morris was also supporting his mistress financially. Although he'd given me money for living expenses and said, I'll save the rest for our children's future, he hadn't saved a dime. The messages got worse. My kid's already in elementary school, so he's not cute anymore. And caring for the old man is a pain, but thank God for my idle wife. It's a waste of money to put him in a care facility, but having my wife do it is free. Gotta make use of free labor, right? LOL. He was ridiculing me and our children. Under normal circumstances, I should have kept my cool and stayed silent until I had definitive evidence, but I was so furious, I couldn't remain calm. As soon as Morris got out of the bath, I shoved his mobile phone in his face and demanded, What is this about? At first, Morris seemed a little taken aback, but he quickly regained his composure. You've lost your femininity since you had our kids, he said, scorn filling his words. You've stopped wearing makeup, and your outfits are all about comfort. Since you started breastfeeding our second child and falling asleep with your mouth open, I felt completely turned off. And when you began caring for my dad, you lost even more of your femininity. You're not even a middle-aged woman anymore, more like a middle-aged man. His cruel words tore at my heart. But he didn't stop there. You know, my girlfriend always wears makeup and takes care of her appearance, even after having a child, he continued, coldly asserting. I have no plans to divorce you for appearance's sake, but my love is for her and our child. I'm not sure who'll go first, but once my dad is gone and our kids are adults, I plan to kick you out and live in the house with her. And so he continued to spew words indicating he considered me nothing more than trash, even though he appeared to have some concern for the children. I couldn't hold back my tears any longer. I too want to dress up and put on proper makeup, but you didn't help with childcare or housework at all. Juggling unfamiliar childcare and trying to do housework perfectly, I had to do it frantically, even if it meant messing up my hair. If you wanted me to look beautiful, why didn't you help with housework, childcare, or even the elder care? And even without a payback, shouldn't a husband and a father naturally help out? I pleaded through my tears, but my words didn't resonate with Morris. That's not true. Look at other women. They stay beautiful while raising their kids. As I've told you many times, it's just that you're not efficient. You, a stay-at-home mom, have no right to argue with me, the one who's putting food on the table, he coldly retorted. If you have a complaint, you're free to divorce, you know? For a woman in her mid-30s like you, employment opportunities are limited, right? You think you can raise our 2 kids just because you'll get a bit of alimony and compensation from me? He sneered. I felt struck in the worst possible way, and I couldn't say anything in return. Thinking about the children, I felt I couldn't divorce. Seeing this, Morris said, You can't, can you? If you care about the kids, you'll take care of my father until the end. After that, you'll work as my housekeeper. But don't worry, when the kids grow up, they'll help you out. So you better treat them well. Ha ha ha. He then went into his room with a satisfied smirk. For a while, I was dumbfounded and remained in place. Somehow I managed to regain my sanity and went to attend to my father-in-law. I intended to act as usual, but it must have been clear something was wrong. My father-in-law asked, "Is something wrong?" I tried to brush it off, saying, "Nothing at all." I couldn't hold back my tears, and I ended up telling him everything. After hearing me out, he said, "Alvina, I have something to give you. Can you come back in a few hours?" I did as he asked, and when I went to him after a few hours, he handed me a piece of paper with someone's contact details and said, "Contact this person." He then added, "They know everything. I should be the one taking action, but with this body of mine." He smiled brightly. A few days later, Morris told me, "As I told you before, I will be on a business trip for a week from now. Well, I guess it's better for you too if we call it a business trip, right? I will enjoy the sightseeing, so I decided to take this opportunity to take action." And a week later, "Hey, what the hell is going on? I come home and everything is gone?" Morris was raging and half panicking when he called me. I replied, "Oh, my, how was your week-long affair trip? Did you enjoy it?" Morris shouted, "Hey, stop messing around. I'm asking what the hell is going on." I decided to explain to Morris. The contact that my father-in-law gave me was for a Mr. Quarry, an old friend of his and a well-known, large-scale landowner in the region. Apparently, Mr. Quarry had always coveted the land where my in-laws' house stood and had been trying to negotiate for it. However, my father-in-law would always refuse, saying, "I plan to leave it to my son." But after observing the behavior of his son Morris and hearing my story, he seemed to have decided that his son was a lost cause. We had known in advance that Morris was planning to take a week-long affair trip because he was openly defiant and didn't try to hide it at all. Before that week, I had a talk with Mr. Quarry and we arranged to sell the house and land. It was a piece of land that Mr. Quarry had wanted for quite some time, so he was willing to buy it at a price considerably higher than the market rate. And during that week, the house was demolished. My father-in-law had requested Mr. Quarry, "This might be a bit selfish, but given the circumstances, could you do the demolition during this period if you're planning to anyway?" So when Morris came back, all he found was an empty lot. And we're going to have a new house built with my money my father-in-law got from selling the old house and land. Upon hearing this, Morris tried to persuade me to return to him, saying, "But you're jobless, aren't you? Even if Dad builds a house, you can't expect to be supported for the rest of your life. What are you going to do without my income? It's going to be tough, right?" I replied, "Well, don't worry about that. I did have some concerns about that part, but my father-in-law and Mr. Quarry have done quite a bit. I got a job offer from a company run by an acquaintance who happens to be looking for employees." And then I asked him, "Morris, shouldn't you be worrying about yourself instead?" When Morris suspiciously asked, "What do you mean?" I told him, "The company where you are working now, you got it because the president is a friend of your father's. But now that he's deciding to cut ties with you, he's spoken to the president. Feel free to fire him if this work is poor and he's committing adultery." The president responded, "It was hard to say, but he's been acting like he can't be fired and causing trouble. Let's see what happens from tomorrow." All I heard from the other end of the line was a surprised, "What?" Then silence. He tried to excuse himself, saying, "Well, I mean, I might have said some things out of anger before, like I was going to leave you in the future, but come on, that can't be true. Don't take it seriously. We're family. We should stick together, right? Can't you mediate between me and Dad?" So I told him, my family now is my daughters and my father-in-law. Goodbye, and hung up the phone. There were numerous calls from Morris after that, but I ignored them all. Later on, my divorce from Morris was finalized. I claimed compensation from Morris and his mistress. As Morris hadn't tried to hide his affair at all, I had gathered plenty of evidence. All of this information I heard from various people, such as the president of Morris's company, who was a friend of my father-in-law. Although it seems like extramarital affair wouldn't have led to this firing, astonishingly, Morris was embezzling company funds to support his double life. Morris was not only fired from his job, but he's also being sued for damages. He lost his home and job and tried to move in with his mistress, only to be dumped when she realized he had no money. On top of all of this, he was ordered to pay child support. Now Morris is spending his days job hunting while working multiple part-time jobs to pay off his debts and child support. As for me, I plan to live with my daughters and my father-in-law in a fully leased house until I move into the house that my father-in-law is building for us. When father-in-law offered to build the house, he said, "I'm moving into a care facility. I want you and your daughters to live happily here, Alvina." I countered, "What are you talking about, Dad? We're family. Besides, it would make the girls sad. Let's live together." Hearing this, my daughters also took father-in-law's hand and said, "We want to live with Grandpa." With tears in his eyes, father-in-law thanked us. While the girls do help out, caring for him while working is indeed tough, so we are currently enjoying our life together as a family of 4 with the help of home assistants and day services. We can't wait to move into our new home as a family of 4.
The sterile white of the hospital room was supposed to symbolize a beginning, but for me it felt like the end. He looks just like you, Alex, I said, a forced chuckle hiding my trembling voice. Nathan's and Melissa's eyes snapped to mine, a symphony of denial in their reaction. Ridiculous, Laura. What are you saying? Nathan's laugh was too sharp, too quick. Melissa just shook her head, avoiding my gaze. Our life had been simple before this. Nathan, Ava, and I in our cozy home, living what I thought was a happy existence. When Melissa, Nathan's sister-in-law, struggled to conceive, we all felt her pain. Her eventual pregnancy was a joy we all shared, or so I believed. Walking into the hospital that day, I expected to feel nothing but happiness. But Nathan's attention wasn't on his niece or nephew. It was fixated on Melissa in a way that clawed at my insides. Melissa did great, didn't she? He kept saying, his voice soft, tender even. It was a tone I hadn't heard in years, not since Ava was born. The drive home was silent. Nathan's mind seemed miles away, and I couldn't stop the gnawing feeling in my gut that something was deeply wrong. A few days later, Derek, Melissa's husband, came over. Our daughters played together as we sat, nursing our coffees. Nathan's been a great support to Melissa, he started, his voice trailing off. Yeah, he's been amazing, I replied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Derek looked at me, his eyes searching. Laura, do you think it's normal how close Nathan and Melissa have become? I wanted to scream, to tell him it wasn't. But fear, a constant companion these days, kept me silent. The next few weeks were a blur of Nathan's late nights and my growing suspicions. He was always texting, smiling at his phone in a way he hadn't smiled at me in months. It's just work, Laura. You know how it is. He'd dismiss my concerns, but the seed of doubt had already taken root. One evening I found lipstick on his collar, a shade I never wore. It's nothing, a misunderstanding, Nathan said, his voice calm, too calm. But his eyes, they couldn't meet mine. I lay awake that night, listening to his steady breaths, feeling the chasm between us widen. The man I married, the father of my child, was a stranger to me now. The thought of confronting him, of hearing him admit to an affair with Melissa, was too much to bear. So I chose silence. A silent witness to my own heartbreak. The days turned into weeks, each one heavier than the last. Nathan's visits to Melissa became more frequent, his excuses more flimsy. She needs help with the baby, he'd say. But Ava had never needed him like that. Our daughter had grown up barely knowing her father's touch, his affection. It was all reserved for Melissa now. Derek and I started talking more, sharing our fears and doubts. I think they're having an affair, he finally said one day, his voice heavy with resignation. The words hung in the air, a confirmation of my worst fears. What do we do now? I asked, feeling defeated, lost. We need proof, Derek replied, determination in his voice. For our peace of mind, for the sake of our families. So we decided to hire a detective to shine a light on the deceit that had crept into our lives. It was a step into the unknown, a final acknowledgement that the life I thought I had was nothing but a lie. As I lay in bed that night, Nathan's silent form beside me, I couldn't help but wonder how we got here. The love we shared, the dreams we built, how had it all come to this? The answer, I feared, was lying right beside me, hidden behind closed eyes and a facade of innocence. 2 weeks had passed since Derek and I made the decision to uncover the truth. Each day felt like a march through a minefield, each step threatening to blow up the facade of our lives. Derek came over with the detective's first report. You ready for this? He asked, his voice steady, but his hands betraying a slight tremor. As I'll ever be, I replied, feeling anything but ready. We sat at the kitchen table, the sounds of our children playing outside a stark contrast to the tension between us. He opened the envelope, and we pored over the photos and texts. Nathan and Melissa at a cafe, their heads close together, laughing. Another photo showed them shopping, Nathan's hand lightly touching Melissa's back. The texts were even more damning, filled with endearments and plans to meet up when they knew Derek and I would be occupied. I can't believe this, I whispered, the words like shards of glass in my throat. How could they do this to us? Derek's face was a mask of pain and anger. We confront them, together. The confrontation was planned for the next evening at our house. The waiting was excruciating, time stretching out, each second heavy with dread and anger. Finally, they arrived, Nathan and Melissa, looking too comfortable in their deceit. We sat in the living room, the air thick with tension. Derek wasted no time. We know about the affair, he said, his voice cutting through the silence. Melissa's face went white, while Nathan's expression hardened. What affair? Nathan's voice was cold, dismissive. Don't play dumb, Nathan, I said, finding my voice. We have proof. I threw the photos and texts on the coffee table in front of them. Melissa picked up one of the photos, her hands shaking. It's not what it looks like, she started, her voice barely above a whisper. Really? Because it looks like you're betraying your family. Derek's voice rose, his anger palpable. Nathan stood up, his demeanor changing. You're overreacting. We're just close, that's all. Close? I echoed, disbelief and anger coursing through me. You call this being just close? I pointed at a photo of them kissing. It was a mistake, Melissa finally admitted, tears starting to form in her eyes. A mistake? Derek laughed bitterly. How many times do you mistake your way into my wife's arms, Nathan? Nathan was silent, his facade crumbling. We're going to sort this out, I said, my voice steady with resolve. You two need to decide where your loyalties lie, with each other or with your families. The room was silent, the only sound Melissa's quiet sobbing. Nathan looked at me, then at Derek, a mix of defiance and guilt in his eyes. This isn't over, Derek said, standing up. We'll be seeking legal advice. Nathan and Melissa left without another word, the gap between us now a chasm too wide to ever bridge again. After they left, Derek and I sat in silence, the weight of our discovery settling around us like a shroud. What now? I finally asked, my voice hollow. Now, we rebuild. Without them, Derek replied, his voice firm but his eyes showing the pain of betrayal. We agreed to proceed with the divorces, a decision that felt like signing a death warrant to the life we thought we had. But there was no going back. The shadows of doubt had lifted, revealing the ugly truth beneath. As Derek left, he turned to me, a sad smile on his face. We'll get through this, Laura, for our kids. I nodded, watching him walk away, feeling the solidarity between us. We were united in our betrayal, but also in our determination to rise from the ashes of our broken marriages. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but we were ready to face them. Together, we would seek our revenge, not through petty acts, but by reclaiming our lives and showing Nathan and Melissa that we were stronger than their deceit. The day of the confrontation had arrived. Derek and I had arranged to meet Nathan and Melissa at Derek's house, a neutral ground laden with memories of better days. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your heart beat out of your chest. Nathan and Melissa sat across from us, a gulf of betrayal between. Their faces were masks of apprehension, a stark contrast to Derek's steely resolve and my simmering anger. Derek didn't waste a moment. We've seen the evidence. Now we want to hear it from you. What's been going on? His voice was calm, but the underlying fury was palpable. Melissa glanced at Nathan, a silent plea for support. Nathan cleared his throat, his usual confidence nowhere in sight. We didn't mean for this to happen, he began, his voice a mere shadow of its former self. It just did. Just did? I echoed, incredulity lacing my tone. You make it sound like an accident. It was a mistake, Melissa interjected, her voice trembling. We never meant to hurt anyone. A mistake? Derek's laughter was bitter, filled with scorn. You call destroying our families a mistake? Nathan looked at me, desperation in his eyes. Laura? Don't. I cut him off, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Don't you dare try to justify your actions to me. The room fell silent, the tension a tangible entity that wrapped around us, suffocating. Derek leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Nathan and Melissa. We're done here. We've heard enough. But what about us? What about our families? Melissa's plea was met with a cold, hard truth from Derek. There is no us anymore. You two made sure of that. His words were final, a door slamming shut on any hope of reconciliation. As Nathan and Melissa left, the reality of our situation sank in. The betrayal was out in the open, but it did little to ease the pain. If anything, it amplified it, each word from Nathan and Melissa a knife twisting deeper. Derek and I sat in silence, the aftermath of the confrontation settling around us like dust after a storm. What now? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Now we move forward, Derek replied, his voice firm. We start the divorce proceedings, and we make sure they understand the gravity of what they've done. I nodded, the path ahead clear but daunting. This was just the beginning. Nathan and Melissa had to face the consequences of their actions. not just in our broken hearts, but in their shattered realities. The following weeks were a blur of legal meetings and paperwork, a constant reminder of the betrayal. But amidst the chaos, a resolve solidified within me. Nathan and Melissa would not get away with tearing our families apart without facing the repercussions. Derek and I were in constant communication, our bond strengthened by our shared resolve for justice. "They won't know what hit them," Derek said during one of our strategy meetings. His determination was infectious, a beacon of strength in the overwhelming darkness. The day we filed for divorce was somber, yet there was an undercurrent of empowerment. We were taking control, no longer victims of Nathan and Melissa's selfish desires. As I signed the papers, my hands steady, I couldn't help but think about the journey ahead. It would be fraught with challenges, but I was ready to reclaim my life, to show Nathan that he hadn't broken me. I was stronger than his betrayal, and I would emerge from this ordeal not just intact, but reborn. The battle lines were drawn, and this was just the beginning. Nathan and Melissa would soon learn that their actions had consequences, and Derek and I were just getting started. The legal battle was in full swing. Derek and I sat across from our respective lawyers in a conference room that felt too cold, too impersonal for the storm of emotions brewing inside me. We were about to discuss our strategy for the upcoming court sessions, a plan that would ensure Nathan and Melissa felt the full weight of their betrayal. Our primary focus is on the financial repercussions and the custody arrangements, Derek's lawyer began, his voice all business. We have a strong case, given the evidence of infidelity and the impact on your families. I nodded, my mind racing. The thought of Nathan and Melissa squirming in their seats, faced with the cold, hard facts of their actions, gave me a grim sense of satisfaction. Derek leaned in, his voice low but fierce. "We're not just going for a simple divorce settlement. We want to make sure they understand the pain they've caused, financially and emotionally." The lawyers outlined the strategy, including demands for alimony, child support, and even punitive damages for emotional distress. With each point they made, I felt a step closer to justice, a step closer to making Nathan and Melissa pay for the havoc they'd wreaked. As we wrapped up the meeting, my lawyer handed me a stack of documents. "These are the filings for the court. Once these are processed, it's only a matter of time." I took the documents, the weight of them in my hands symbolizing the gravity of the situation. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady. "I want them to regret ever crossing us." The day of the first court session arrived. Nathan and Melissa were already seated when Derek and I walked in, their faces a mix of defiance and nervousness. As we took our seats, I caught Nathan's eye, his gaze quickly shifting away, unable to hold mine. The proceedings were a blur, the lawyers presenting the evidence, arguing our cases with clinical precision. Nathan and Melissa's lawyer tried to downplay the affair, painting it as a momentary lapse in judgment, but the evidence spoke louder than his words. During a recess, I stepped outside for air, the weight of the courtroom suffocating. Nathan followed, a desperate look on his face. "Laura, can't we talk about this?" "There has to be another way," he pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to him, my resolve as strong as ever. "Talk? After everything you've done? You're delusional, Nathan." He reached out as if to touch my arm, but I stepped back. "You'll pay for what you've done, both financially and by losing us. You've already lost everything that mattered." Returning to the courtroom, I felt empowered, my path clear. Nathan and Melissa had chosen their fate the moment they betrayed our trust, and now they were facing the consequences. As the judge announced a recess until the next session, Derek and I shared a look of determination. This was far from over, but we were on the right track. Nathan and Melissa's lawyer seemed rattled, a sign that our strategy was working. Outside the courtroom, Derek and I discussed our next steps. "They think they can get away with a slap on the wrist. We'll show them how wrong they are," Derek said, anger lacing his voice. I nodded, the fire of revenge burning brighter within me. They'll regret the day they decided to betray us. This is just the beginning. As we left the courthouse, the cold air felt invigorating, a stark contrast to the heated emotions inside. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready for the fight. Nathan and Melissa would learn the hard way that actions have consequences, and Derek and I were the harbingers of their reckoning. The days leading up to the final court session were filled with a tense anticipation. Derek and I had become fixtures in each other's lives, our shared quest for justice, a bond that was unbreakable. We spent hours poring over documents and strategizing with our lawyers, determined to leave no stone unturned. On the eve of the final session, Derek called me. "Tomorrow's it, Laura. Are you ready?" "As I'll ever be," I replied, my voice tinged with a mix of nerves and determination. "We've got this. They won't know what hit them," he said, his confidence bolstering my spirits. The courtroom was packed the next day, a silent audience to the final act of our drama. Nathan and Melissa sat together, a united front that belied the cracks in their facade. As the session began, our lawyer presented our closing arguments with precision and unwavering conviction. He laid out the financial demands, the request for sole custody, and the punitive damages for the emotional toll their actions had taken on us. Nathan's lawyer attempted a rebuttal, arguing for leniency and a more equitable division of assets. My clients regret their actions, but they shouldn't be financially ruined because of a personal mistake. Derek leaned over to me, whispering, "A personal mistake? They call destroying families a mistake?" I couldn't help but scoff quietly, the absurdity of their defense clear as day. Then it was Melissa's turn to speak. She stood, her voice shaky. "I know we've caused pain, and I'm truly sorry for that. But please, think of the financial consequences. We have a child to think about." Her plea hung in the air, but my heart had hardened against their excuses. They thought of consequences only when faced with them, not when they embarked on their affair. Finally, Nathan stood. "I've made mistakes, but I'm asking for a chance to make things right. Don't let this mistake define our entire lives." The judge listened intently, his expression unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, he announced he would deliver his decision. The wait was agonizing, each tick of the clock a reminder of what was at stake. When the judge returned, the room fell silent. He began to speak, his voice firm. "After careful consideration, the court has decided to grant the plaintiff's requests for alimony, child support, and partial punitive damages. The betrayal and its impact on the families cannot be overlooked." A gasp went through the room, Nathan and Melissa's faces turning pale. The judge continued, outlining the financial ramifications and the custody arrangements that favored Derek and me. As the judge concluded, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Justice had been served, not just in words but in actions that would ensure Nathan and Melissa felt the consequences of their betrayal. Outside the courthouse, Derek and I shared a moment of quiet victory. "We did it," he said, a smile breaking through the exhaustion. "We did," I replied, the reality of our victory sinking in. They finally got what they deserved. As we parted ways, I felt a chapter of my life closing. The pain of betrayal would always be a part of me, but so would the strength I found in standing up for myself. Nathan and Melissa's downfall was a testament to karma's unyielding grip. They had chosen their path, and now they were forced to walk it, burdened by the financial and emotional weight of their choices. The drive home was reflective, a mix of sadness for what was lost and hope for what lay ahead. The battle was over, but the war for my own peace and happiness was just beginning. I was ready to face it head-on, armed with the knowledge that justice, in the end, always finds a way. In the aftermath of the court's decision, the world seemed to shift on its axis. The victory was bittersweet, the taste of justice mingled with the remnants of a life unraveled. Yet, amidst the rubble of broken relationships and shattered trust, a new resolve took root within me. The first signs of Nathan and Melissa's unraveling came swiftly. Nathan, burdened by the financial obligations imposed by the court, reached out in a desperate attempt to renegotiate the terms. "I can't afford this, Laura. It's going to ruin me," he pleaded over the phone, his voice a mix of desperation and disbelief. "The court has made its decision, Nathan. You should have thought about the consequences before," I replied, my voice steady, devoid of the warmth it once held for him. "But what about Ava? What about our family?" His attempt to tug at my heartstrings fell flat, the mention of our daughter igniting a protective fierceness within me. "Our family was broken the moment you chose Melissa over us. You're facing the consequences of your actions now," I said, hanging up before he could respond. The finality in my voice marked the end of our conversation, and in many ways, the end of our connection. Melissa, too, faced her comeuppance. With Nathan's finances in disarray, she found herself grappling with the reality of raising their child without the lavish lifestyle she was accustomed to. Her complaints filled the air, reaching me through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances who still lingered on the fringes of my life. "It's not fair. This isn't the life I signed up for," she lamented to anyone who would listen, her voice tinged with bitterness and regret. The schadenfreude I felt was tempered by a hint of pity, not for Melissa, but for the innocent child caught in the crossfire of adult folly. Derek and I, through our shared ordeal, had grown closer, our conversations a blend of commiseration and burgeoning friendship. One evening, over coffee, he shared a piece of news that felt like the final nail in the coffin of Nathan and Melissa's deceit. "They're struggling to make ends meet. Melissa's been looking for work, and Nathan's second job barely covers the alimony and child support," Derek said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice that mirrored my own. "It's the bed they made. Now they have to lie in it," I responded, the sentiment echoing the harsh reality of their situation. Our dialogue was interrupted by Ava's laughter, a sound that brought home the reason for all our struggles. Derek's daughter, too, found joy in the simple moments we shared, her presence a balm to the wounds of the past. As the days turned into weeks, the tangible outcomes of our legal victory became evident. Nathan and Melissa's facade of unity crumbled under the weight of financial strain and public scrutiny. Their attempts to maintain a semblance of normalcy were met with the cold, hard truth of their actions and the repercussions that followed. In the midst of their downfall, Derek and I found a semblance of peace. Our meetings, once dominated by strategies for legal battles, now gave way to conversations about healing and moving forward. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Derek mused one afternoon as we watched our children play in the park, their laughter a testament to their resilience. "We have," I agreed, allowing myself a moment to reflect on the journey. "And we'll keep moving forward, for them and for ourselves." The chapter of betrayal and revenge had closed, leaving behind lessons learned and strength gained. Nathan and Melissa's descent was a testament to the power of karma, a reminder that actions always have consequences. For Derek and I, the path ahead was clearer, paved with the promise of new beginnings and the determination to build a future defined not by the past, but by the possibilities that lay ahead.